In this video, we're going to talk about reaction mechanisms. So, most chemical reactions do not occur in a single step. They occur through a series of individual steps known as the reaction mechanism. And each one of those individual steps is called an elementary step. So, to this point, when we've written chemical equations, what we write represents the overall chemical reaction. Right, so the overall chemical reaction tells us what reactants are present at the beginning, and it tells us what the products are at the end of the reaction, but it does not tell us how we get from the reactants to the products. Right, usually sort of behind the overall reaction, there's a series of individual steps that combine to tell us how we get from the reactants to the products, what things are actually colliding in these different steps in order for the chemical reaction to happen. Alright, so on this slide, we have an example of an overall reaction and its associated reaction mechanism. So, in the overall reaction, if we have one H2 molecule, it reacts with two ICl molecules, and the final products are two molecules of HCl and one molecule of I2. But this doesn't happen all at once, right? The hydrogen doesn't collide with two iodine monochloride molecules all at once. It happens in a number of different steps. In this case, it happens in two steps. So in the first step, the H2 molecule collides with one molecule of ICl, and that gives us HI and HCl. And then in the second step, the HI that we made in the first step then reacts with a second ICl molecule to produce HCl again, and then I2. And so one thing that must always be true about a reaction mechanism is when I add up the individual steps, it should give us the overall reaction. And so this is very similar to back when we were doing Hess's law with enthalpy. And so anything that appears on both the product and the reactant side, we can cancel out. And so in this case, the thing that we can cancel out is this HI. Right, we have one molecule or 1 mole of HI on the product side and 1 molecule or 1 mole of HI on the reactant side, and so we can cancel that out. And then when we add up what's left, we get 1 H2 and 2 ICLs, and that makes 2 HCLs and an I2. And so you can see when I add up the two mechanistic steps, the reaction I get matches the overall reaction. And these things that we crossed out, if first it appears as a product and then gets used up as a reactant, we call that a reaction intermediate. And note that the reaction intermediates do not appear in the overall reaction. So again, these mechanistic steps, each one of these we would call an elementary step. It tells us what molecules are actually smashing into each other during the chemical reaction. And so this occurs in two essentially different smashing togethers. First, an H2 smashes into an ICl. It gives us one of our HCl products and the intermediate. And then in a separate step, the intermediate collides with a second iodine monochloride molecule to give us our second HCl and our I2. Alright, so an important concept related to reaction mechanisms is what's called the molecularity. And so the molecularity is the number of reactant molecules involved in a particular elementary step. Right, so it's the number of molecules that are actually colliding together. And as we saw in some of the very first material we covered in this chapter, when we're given an overall reaction, I can't use the stoichiometry of that overall reaction to write the rate law. But it turns out we can do that if we know we're talking about an elementary step. And so the order with respect to each reagent in an elementary step is determined by the number of those molecules that are involved. So for example, if we have an elementary step and it just involves 1 mole or 1 molecule of A being converted to products, then the rate law for that step is the rate is equal to K times A to the first power, right? Because there's only one A. And we would call this a unimolecular reaction, right? That's the molecularity. The molecularity would be unimolecular, right? One molecule is involved in this case, there's only one thing, so it's not colliding. We would say it's decomposing, but only one molecule is involved on the reactants. If, on the other hand, we had this elementary step, where we could, here we've written it as A plus A, or we could have written it as just 2A, now there are two molecules involved in that elementary step, and so they are, in this case, actually going to be colliding. In this case, the rate law would be rate is equal to K times A to the second power, because I have two A's involved in this elementary step. And anytime we have two things colliding, the molecularity of this step would be bimolecular. But the two things that collide in a bimolecular step don't have to be the same. If I had two different molecules colliding, right, there's still two things colliding, so it would still be bimolecular. And in this case, the rate law of this elementary step would be rate is equal to K times A to the first power and B to the first power. Now, by far the most common elementary steps are unimolecular and bimolecular. We do rarely see termolecular reactions, and we have a couple examples down here, right? If I have three A's reacting, that would be third order with respect to A, and this would be a termolecular reaction, or I could have two A's and a B, or they could all be different. In any case, these would all be termolecular reactions. The reason termolecular reactions are rare is because the probability of three molecules all colliding at the same time, and then if you remember our discussion of the Arrhenius equation, not only do they have to collide at the same time, but they have to collide in the correct orientation. That's just a very low probability event. And so termolecular or higher molecularities in reactions are fairly rare. And most reactions are only going to be unimolecular, or the elementary steps of most reactions are going to be unimolecular or bimolecular. Right, so another important concept related to reaction mechanisms is the idea of the rate determining step. And so the analogy I always use when talking about rate determining steps is the colloquialism, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Well, the way that relates to reaction mechanisms is that a reaction is only as fast as its slowest step. And so even if most of the elementary steps are really fast, if you have one really slow step relative to the other ones, that one slowest step is going to determine how fast the reaction is, because the reactions before and after that really slow step are essentially going to be waiting on that slow step to happen. So if one step is significantly slower than all the others, it will be the rate determining step. And so in general, when we're evaluating mechanisms, it can be kind of hard to determine what the mechanism for a reaction is. And so in order for a mechanism to be validated, and I say here not proven, right? It's very hard to prove something is true, but to give us confidence that it's probably right, two things that certainly must be true: the elementary steps must add up to the overall reaction, and the rate law predicted by the mechanism must be consistent with the experimentally observed rate law. And very often, to determine the rate law given the mechanism, we're going to be using the idea of this rate determining step, and we'll see some examples of how we actually do that. Alright, so here's an example problem. And in this example problem, we're given an overall reaction, and we're also told what the experimentally determined rate law is. Finally, we're given a proposed mechanism, and they've told us that the first step is slow and the second step is fast. And we want to know, is this mechanism consistent with the experimental evidence? The experimental evidence being the experimentally determined rate law and the overall reaction. So there are two things that we should check. Does the mechanism add up to the overall reaction? And so in this case, we want to check. We want to cancel out anything that appears on both the reactants and the product side. So I think I have an NO3 on the products here and an NO3 on the reactants. And I also have an NO2 on the reactants and an NO2 on the products. And so what I'm left with is NO2 plus CO makes NO plus CO2. And so when I add up the elementary steps of my mechanism, that does match the overall reaction. So the first criteria is met. My elementary steps add up to the overall reaction. Then the next thing I need to check is, does my mechanism match the experimentally determined rate law? And so let me give myself some room here. I'm going to erase some of this stuff. All right, and so since we're told that the first step is slow and the second step is fast, that means that the first step is my rate determining step. And we also know that because this is an elementary step, I can write the rate law for that elementary step. And so the rate law for step 1 is going to be rate times the rate constant times NO2 squared, because there are two molecules of NO2 colliding in this elementary step. And since the rate of the reaction will depend on the rate determining step, if I can write the rate law for the rate determining step, this will also be the rate law for the overall reaction, at least according to this mechanism. And so if you know the rate determining step, you can write the rate law for that elementary step, and then the overall reaction will share that rate law. And so we would predict, based on this mechanism, that the rate law should be this, and that matches the experimentally determined rate law. So at least based on those two criteria, this mechanism seems reasonable. One question I'll often ask about mechanisms is for you to draw a reaction energy diagram. And so this would be the reaction energy diagram, or one possible example for the reaction energy diagram for the last reaction. So I think one thing that they would have had to tell us is that, in this case, if they told us that the reaction is exothermic. And so what that's telling me is, how does the energy of the reactants relate to the energy of the products? If the reaction is exothermic, the reaction should be losing energy, or enthalpy. I'm sort of using those interchangeably. That's not 100% correct, but it'll work for this discussion. And so, indeed, the products are lower in energy than the reactants, so that's consistent with the reaction being exothermic. And then, when we look at the reaction energy diagram, the number of peaks in the reaction energy diagram should match the number of steps in the mechanism. So the previous mechanism was 2 steps, so I have 2 peaks to get over. These represent the activation energies of each of those steps. And then the other thing that should be true is, the slower a step is, the higher its activation energy. Or we can think about that the other way, right? The higher the activation energy, the slower the step is going to be. So in the previous mechanism, we knew that the first step was the slow step, so the activation energy of the first step in the mechanism should have the highest activation energy, which it does. So in this case, right, the first step is slowest, so that's the rate determining step. It should have the highest peak. And the second step was faster, so it should have a lower activation energy. All right, so in the last example, the first step was the slow step, and so it was a little bit easier. But let's look at another example where the first step is fast and the second step is slow. And to solve this problem, we're going to take advantage of what's called the Pre-Equilibrium Approximation. We'll talk about what that is as we go forward. So here we have the overall reaction, and if we add up our steps, right, the N2O2 is an intermediate that's going to be canceled out. And if the second step is the slow step, we can write that the rate of that step is equal to what I'm going to call K2. Since we have multiple reactions, multiple elementary steps, each one is going to have a separate rate constant. And so I'll talk about this K-1 in a minute, but if we call the rate constant of the forward first reaction K1, the rate constant of the second elementary step K2, then the rate law for the rate determining step, the second step in this case, would be rate is K2 times N2O2 times the concentration of O2. Right? There's one N2O2, one O2, so N2O2 to the first power, NO2 to the first power. Now the reason I've circled this N2O2 in both the reaction and in this rate law is N2O2 is an intermediate. And determining the concentration of intermediates can be very hard. And so generally, we don't want a rate law for an overall reaction to include an intermediate. So while this rate law may be formally correct, it's not very useful. And so we want to somehow get rid of intermediates in our rate laws. And we can do that by employing what we call the pre-equilibrium approximation, at least in this example. So let's see what's involved with that. So if this mechanism is correct, where the first step is fast and the second step is slow, as the reaction proceeds, we're going to build up the concentration of N2O2, right, as it's kind of waiting for this second reaction to happen. Well, as we're going to talk about a whole lot in the next chapter, and that we've already kind of talked about already in terms of vapor pressure and saturated solutions, most, if not all, chemical reactions can be run in both directions. I can have two NOs react to form N2O2, and I can have an N2O2 decompose to form two NO molecules. And so when the reaction starts, I only have reactants, and so these two NO molecules are going to react to form N2O2, and that concentration of N2O2 is going to build up. But because this second step is slow, the N2O2 is kind of waiting around and saying, like, I'm not doing anything. I might as well react back the other way to reform two NO molecules. And so just like vapor pressure or saturated solutions, as the reaction proceeds, if the first steps are sufficiently fast and the second step is sufficiently slow, we'll effectively achieve dynamic equilibrium, where the rate of the forward first reaction is equal to the rate of the reverse reaction. And I'm calling the rate constant for the reverse of the first reaction K minus 1 to distinguish it from K1, the rate constant for the forward reaction. And so since this is a mechanism and these are both elementary steps, we can say that the rate of the forward first step is K1 times NO squared, and the rate of the reverse of the first reaction is K minus 1 times the concentration of N2O2. And so if we achieve dynamic equilibrium, that means that the rate of the forward reaction is equal to the rate of the reverse reaction. And so if these two are equal, I can set these two expressions equal to each other. So I have that K1 times NO squared is equal to K minus 1 times N2O2. So let's jump to the next slide. Right, so this is our overall reaction. Our rate law from applying the concept of the rate determining step is this, but it's got the intermediate in here that we don't want. But by applying the pre-equilibrium approximation, we were able to write this expression. And so what I can do now is I'm going to solve for N2O2, and then once I have an expression for N2O2, I'm going to plug it back in here, and hopefully I'll be able to remove any intermediates from this rate law. And so by solving for N2O2 in this reaction, I want to divide both sides by K minus 1. And so I end up with the concentration of N2O2 is equal to K1 over K minus 1 times the concentration of NO squared. Right, now I can take this expression for N2O2, plug it in up here, and then my rate law for both the rate determining step and by consequence the rate law for the overall reaction becomes rate is equal to K2 times K1 over K minus 1 times the concentration of NO squared times the concentration of O2. And now my rate law only includes things that appear in the overall reaction. It doesn't include any intermediates anymore. And so now we are happy with this rate law. And so this would be the rate law for the overall reaction. Alright, so one more slide here. I just wanted to show an example of what the reaction energy diagram of this reaction might look like. And again, they would have to tell us whether the reaction was exothermic or endothermic to determine what the relative energies of the reactants and products are. This would be an example if the reaction was exothermic again, because the reactants are higher in energy than the products. But we can see there are two mountains to climb, and that's consistent with the two steps of the mechanism. And now because the second step was slow, it should be higher in energy than the first step. All right, and I've got two hopefully helpful example videos on evaluating mechanisms. And so I encourage you to take a look at those before trying the pre-class problems.